Hey everyone, welcome to Peace Talks, brave conversations about formation, justice, and peace.
Today's conversation is with Caitlin Reed and Stacy Elliott from End Slavery Tennessee, an organization dedicated to nurturing survivor healing and strategically combating human trafficking in Tennessee.
Caitlin and Stacy unpacked not only what trafficking is, but also challenged us to imagine a world in which the church provides a safe place for victims and perpetrators alike to speak truth and receive healing.
Our conversation was both informative and transformative, but before we begin, we want to inform you that this episode contains sensitive subject matter and may not be appropriate for all.
Caitlin and Stacy, thank you so much for being here today with us. We're so excited to talk with you and to hear all that you're doing with End Slavery Tennessee and maybe a new big reveal.
Maybe. Breaking news.
Breaking news, listeners, viewers.
Ready.
I'd love to jump in with a couple of fun questions. So, free association here. What did you eat for breakfast?
Well, I'll start then. I had an omelet. Cut up some veggies and just threw together an omelet. It was delicious.
I actually was at a breakfast this morning for one of our partner agencies. So we had some fruit and yogurt and, little continental breakfast situation. And I had lots of coffee, so I'm ready.
That's awesome.
We're ready to go. Question number 2, what are you not good at?
Many things, but probably interior decorating.
Oh, me neither.
When somebody puts together a room or something, I'm just in awe. I don't know how to do it. I can't do that.
I'm a good copier.
You're a good what?
Copier of interior decorating. Yeah.
I am not good at sports. I'm not coordinated. I enjoy sports, watching them. I will cheer on my team, but I'm not a participator.
Fair.
That's fair. I played sports growing up. That's something Bishop Todd and I talk about sometimes. We both played. He played baseball. I played softball.
Yeah, you seem like you would be athletic.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I do. Okay, last question. What is your guilty pleasure currently? Nobody wants to talk.
I feel like guilty pleasure, the term guilty pleasure puts some shame upon the things that we enjoy.
True.
So true.
What I've been like binging lately is Law and Order, like just old episodes of Law and Order.
Isn't that like the longest running show on television ever?
It's like 21 seasons or something.
Yeah, there's no shame in that. You should be free from that shame.
Zero. They're doing something right.
I know I had that trouble too. What's the guilty pleasure? I avoid guilty pleasure, but I really am all into real great pleasure and maybe a little off. Okay, I'll do a confession. When I go to the movies, I bring my own food. I just can't pay those prices. But I bring good food and I share with my friends and sometimes with the neighbor if I'm in the mood.
And you enjoy the movie all the more because you brought your own comfortable food.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's healthier and I just feel better. But I only feel slightly guilty, but maybe not much.
So do you buy popcorn also or no? Not even the popcorn?
No.
Good for you.
Good for you.
Nope.
I can't get away from the popcorn. I love the popcorn.
I usually bring my own candy, but I do buy the popcorn.
Yeah.
It's just, you can't beat it.
The movie theater popcorn, it's its own thing for sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's true.
Well, we would love to hear from both of you specifically about what initially led you to the space of human trafficking. Just before we get into all the other things, just would love to hear your story about that.
Yeah. So I'm the senior communications and event specialist. And prior to working here at In Slavery / new name coming, I was working at an anti-poverty nonprofit in Nashville. And I've been in nonprofit for 6 or 7 years at this point. But I really was drawn to the organization through a previous organization I worked with. and actually had the opportunity to meet a couple of survivors while I was in that position. And I, like everybody else, had no idea that this was happening here in Nashville, let alone the United States. And it just really resonated. And I met a couple of the survivors and didn't start working here until about 4 or 5 years later, but I thought about them and that experience the entire time. And when an opening came up here with an opening that I was fit for, I really kind of jumped at the chance to start to work here. So
that's awesome.
She's great too. We're really grateful. Really, we were talking about it in the staff meeting the other day. Like, what would we do without Caitlin? She really fits everything we need to fill in some gaps. Anyway, so how I got started, I'm a social worker. I have a master's in social work, and so I've been aware of a lot of community dynamics. But here's what happened in the early part of the 2000s. I saw a show called Dateline NBC, To Catch a Predator. Right? Are you familiar?
Yes.
It's where Chris Hansen and his team, they get together and they're with an undercover sting, right? And they're posing, the good law enforcement agency is posing as a young girl, and they have online conversations with people who agree to come and have a sexual experience.
Yeah.
Wow.
And here's what happened in the interviews. I mean, in the news program. I mean, man after man from every walk of life would show up ready to have a sexual encounter with a young girl.
Yeah.
And I guess I'd never seen anything so blatant. I mean, I knew that people, particularly children, were vulnerable to, being sexually mistreated by more people that they knew. Unfortunately, family members or somebody, a coach or a teacher or a pastor, or I'd been familiar with that sort of, but to have strangers, I was surprised by that. But also, just how in the world do you even think about to go online to find something? This is something that had never entered my mind before. And I was a master's in social work. It's not something I thought about, but it was the first thing that made me go, something's wrong and really wrong, and I have not seen it. I didn't know what to call it then. I just was aware of the dynamic. And a little bit later, at my church, they had a dinner for International Justice Mission, and I learned about human trafficking. I learned the word human trafficking, and I loved their model, where it was an international model at the time, because that's where trafficking was believed to reside, mostly in the early 2000s or early part of 2000s. And they had attorneys and law enforcement on one end of what they did, and then they had the survivor aftercare. So they brought both those things together, which is really important. You can't work without, you have to work in this. So I really respected that. But all of a sudden, not long after that, it clicked for me, and I went, oh my goodness, that's happening here. That's what that was on Dateline NBC.
Yeah.
So my awareness was back then. And the thing that, when I think about my faith journey, I'm always drawn to the things that make me the most uncomfortable.
That's awesome.
Yes.
And that's where I end up. I mean, I've worked with the AIDS community, AIDS and HIV, when people were still dying. I've worked with sudden infant death syndrome. I've worked in hospice, things that, death, all these things that are make me uncomfortable and nervous.
Yeah.
That's where I am. And sexual misconduct, especially toward children, and buying and selling human beings for other services. No, that's very uncomfortable. But that's where I am, and that's how I got here, because of conviction. And when I found then in 2012, when I found In Slavery, Tennessee, and I realized we're something local that I could do something about, I just didn't look back. And from the day I found them, I told the one of two employees at the time, I said, I'm all in. And I began that day to pray daily. For one full year, I made this commitment to pray daily, and not just, but my prayers I had were with, I say, intellectual intention and creative expression. So I would write poems and songs in response in that relationship I had, my faith building. So that it wasn't just a stagnant prayer. It was a growth prayer. And from that point, I was, as a volunteer, I did fundraising, and I did a support group in the Safe House because I have a master's in social work, so I can do that, and leadership development. And then I guess right before the pandemic, they invited me to be on staff.
Perfect.
To do community engagement right before the pandemic.
Yeah.
So it's been a little stagnant with some of the challenges, but I've always been delighted to be a part of, being of education and loving the mission to serve survivors and confront slavery, or we called it slavery, we call it human trafficking now. We don't use that term much anymore. But I've loved the process of being able to do that. And I am in the community engagement specialist, and I also executive produce the podcast that we do called Someone Like Me.
Someone Like Me.
I love, from a formation standpoint, just imagining the type of praying that you were doing. And, this, what you kind of called an anti-stagnant prayer, but something that kind of engaged all of your senses and moved you to a place of growth that actually moved you to a place of action. Mm-hmm. That's very cool.
The openness that takes to engage in prayer in such an imaginative way. It's really, really beautiful. Mm-hmm. I would love to, I'm going to jump a question real quick because I think it fits better here with us using the terminology. Mm-hmm. This may not be the case for everyone, but some people may not know what we mean by the term human trafficking. And so I wonder if you could unpack that for us. Like you said, some people think internationally, not so much domestically. Could you speak to why that might be a misconception, and then also just give us a definition?
Yeah, so I'll start with the definition because some folks might not be completely familiar with the term human trafficking. But it's the exploitation of humans for the purposes such as sexual and labor servitude, where something of value is exchanged. So money, food, housing, drugs, any type of resource, anything worth something. And there has to be means of force, fraud, or coercion. So those are definitely some in the weeds terms. Force can look like physical abuse or assault, sexual abuse or assault, confinement. Fraud looks more like false promises of work or living conditions, withholding promised wages. And then coercion, which we see more often than not, especially in sex trafficking, is threats of harm to self or others, or psychological manipulation, document confiscation we see with labor trafficking. Mm-hmm. And human trafficking here in the States looks very different than internationally. Internationally, you could see instances of kidnap or capture, things like that. But here in the States, it's very different. It's very nuanced. It's complex and dynamic. There's a lot of power and control dynamics at play. It's not typically a random crime. So those, the guy driving by in a white van snatching girls up off the street, that's not really happening. There's a lot more involved with it. It's a lot of relational. It's very relational. So it's typically committed by someone they love or they have a relationship with, which is where we see like familial trafficking. So family members or someone that's in their church or school or a friend of the family, etc., or a boyfriend that they've met online. There's a relationship that's established first before the trafficking really begins.
Wow.
And that leads to victims really being not able to identify. It becomes very, very difficult for victims to come forward because, why would this person do this? They love me, mm-hmm. or that person is my spouse or my partner or my parent.
Right.
So it makes it very difficult for victims to identify. And it is happening here in Tennessee. We serve the Middle Tennessee area, so the Nashville area, and it's been reported in all 41 counties in Middle Tennessee. And it's as likely to occur in suburban areas as it is to occur in urban areas. Of course, we're getting more reports here in the Nashville area just because of our population concentration, but it is happening in more rural areas of the state as well.
I'm just thinking about the evolution of things. And so throughout the 70s and the 80s, the term was stranger danger, right? Don't go to the man in the white van, with the candy or something like that. But now it's people that we know, and that crosses into sexual abuse, but also into human exploitation, like you're talking about.
Yeah. So
we see a lot of crossover between, a lot of crossover between trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, etc. There is a huge overlap in all of those crimes.
And the other thing, there's a huge overlap, when we talk about homelessness and addiction issues, we see those are all correlated. Incarceration, foster care. These are all sort of part of that. If you look at the overlap of where we see the most vulnerable. But I want to think about too, when we think about human trafficking, honestly, it's only been in our vernacular since the year 2000, when there was a federal law that stated, what we were going to talk about human trafficking, and it's taken a while for this kind of concept to kind of sift through down to state level. And frankly, a lot of the drive to address this issue was from faith-based groups. I think I'm not unique in my conviction that this is something that we as a church body and other religious communities, it kind of gets to the core of the belief system about what we are designed to do, what we're supposed to do in response to as human beings. Anyway, so really the laws in the United States have taken a long time to sort of kind of get in line and understand. So because human trafficking wasn't known in our vernacular, and we didn't recognize it, just like Caitlin was saying, we didn't see it, and I didn't see it. And I think some of the things that really we're getting huge paradigm shifts in our thinking about who is the person that is guilty and who is the victim of a crime and who is the perpetrator. And I think about prostitution in big ways. That's really a lot of what happens in sex trafficking. And we've talked with lots of law enforcement, including our CEO, who is was law enforcement and the director of the first human trafficking unit for the TBI, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation.
Oh, wow.
They talk about a paradigm shift in law enforcement, going from arresting people for prostitution and then them getting out and going just right back to it in this terrible cycle. And the person who was controlling them, the trafficker, was getting away with that, getting money and getting away with it. No record, and all the burden was on that. And so when law enforcement began to see people in prostitution as the actual victims, they began to serve them in ways that said, instead of arresting you, I'm going to offer you services and try to find, and instead of looking down upon you and looking at you like, you're the bad guy, I'm going to look at you like you're the one who I need to be helping.
Yes.
So that's been a big shift. And I think that's a big shift for a lot of folks in general in society. You think about what we call people that are sexually promiscuous, right? In our society, the names that we use, particularly for women, and the judgment that we're putting on people because of maybe the way that they dress. And what I challenge people to do is to say, wait a minute, what were the decision processes that person went through to make the choices they made to act in a certain way or dress in a certain way? And so that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to come at it with an understanding of, wait a minute, they're acting in ways that are not socially acceptable, but what got them there?
Right.
And where can I find the compassion? And I think that's what Jesus Christ would have done, the same thing, and said, wait a minute, I see through all of that veneer
Yes.
to the heart, and I want to help you become the most beautiful you can become. I think that's kind of what we do. I hope that's what we do. That's the goal.
Yeah, it sounds like compassion and actually, first of all, curiosity is what paves the way for you to come alongside people and help them. And do you find that they are how does it look with the victims in terms of being willing to receive the help? Mm-hmm. And I mean, does it take time for you to help them understand their situation? Because, if I'm being groomed for this by someone that I love and trust, it's going to take time to understand that that's happening. Is that part of what happens with you?
Yeah. So we actually do an empathy exercise as part of our training that we give frontline professionals, especially law enforcement.
Good.
We walk them through just a generic instance of someone being identified as a victim, and kind of giving space for you to think and reflect and assign some feelings to how you would feel if this person that you thought loved you, that was providing for you, was actually sexually exploiting you.
Yeah.
And you weren't identifying this. You didn't see yourself as a victim. How would you feel? And then enters law enforcement, someone that you don't know, that you might not have a great relationship with to begin with. Mm-hmm. Intervenes, says, you're a victim. This is what's happened to you. Come with me. Who you don't know, you've never met. They're telling you all of these things about you. Mm-hmm. How would you feel? Mm-hmm. And then enter someone from our organization that says, hi, I'm here to help. We think might be what's happened to you, but please let's talk. Let's answer some questions. You still would be very, very, very skeptical of this person coming in and say, here, I'm offering you all of these things and you have to do nothing in return. Mm-hmm. I mean, at every point up until this point, you have been asked to give something in return. So your skepticism, your alarms are flashing, they're going off. Are you going to willingly accept help? What does that look like? I think going through that exercise really helps put people in the position of the survivor. You'll never truly know how you'll react to a situation unless it happens to you, but it can give you a better sense of how you would feel in that situation. And thinking that you would willingly walk away with someone that you just met to take you somewhere that you've never been before, that you don't know where you're going. Would you willingly go? Probably not. Would you be skeptical? Definitely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So do survivors come to us and, praise us and, oh, thank you so much?
Not so much.
No.
And for a lot of good reason. Those alarms should be going off. And so we also talk about how the healing journey is not a linear experience. There are lots of ups and downs, regressions, leaps forward, etc. It doesn't look the same for everyone. Not everyone has the same experience. Not everyone's healing journey looks the same. So there are a lot of push and pull.
Yes. I was thinking about some of the clients that I work with who have experienced sexual abuse or may not even have been trafficked at some point. The naming it takes so long to even just name what it is. And then you're also in the realm of trauma bonding and trying to sift through feelings of complicity along with all of that. And so I wonder if you could just speak to the nature of the longevity of even coming alongside victims and survivors and what that looks like to see it as a marathon and not a sprint. And maybe from the point of view of this being a formational issue where we're not thinking about necessarily the end game, but we're coming alongside of people and how this plays into how we are to come alongside people as Christ.
That's beautifully set up. I will say, this organization did not start out as an organization that serves survivors. It started out as an activist organization. But the process of seeing people and recognizing the gap of services, helping someone go through rehab, getting them to a rehab place and trying to find resources for them, advocating for them in the court system was good. Getting them health care, but it wasn't enough. And that's what we discovered in the process, that what we do is intensive case management. And that means not just getting them a form that fills out and tell these are the resources that are available to you. That's helpful. But you've got to think about the level of trauma experienced by someone who, can I be graphic about things a little bit?
Yes.
I mean, the people that we serve, mostly sex trafficking, they've been raped multiple times a day. Mostly young people, and treated so poorly. I mean, the level of trauma is very difficult to imagine. We think of PTSD in military situations, very, very valid. But there's a comparison and not a comparison. The intensity of that kind of trauma, there's a lot of space that has to be given. So really, one of the foundational things that all of us are engaging is trauma-informed care, making sure that every word, even down to the colors we use. I mean, we really are very, very intentional about how we move in our spaces. How we create the spaces for recovery. These are all part of helping to make sure that process can occur. But even with that, we have to understand that each individual is going through their own journey. And we see the relationship starts very, very slowly. It starts with building trust, helping people identify, offering simple things to help build that relationship and know that can be trusted. And then really the best thing, my favorite referral that we ever get are when people who have been in the life, which is what they call when you're in prostitution and things, when they refer each other, they say, listen, this program is for real. It's working. I'm finding ways to heal, to grow. I'm getting my kids back next year. I've got a job that that I chose. I'm learning to choose things, because when you're somebody who's been in this kind of trauma, you don't get to choose what you wear,
right?
When you sleep,
right?
What you eat. And we walk through individually, personally. That's what intensive case management is about. Each of the therapists walk personally with the person to the grocery store, help them, not judge them for what they choose, but help them walk through making those decisions. Sometimes some of them can't make a decision. They want them to be made for them because they got to practice. And that can be anxiety producing. So I think that maybe gives you a little glimpse on what it's like. And I'll say one more thing about it. We, when people first come, they are resistant and they're testing us. They've been out there in some tough places. And I know they get cussed. Our people on staff sometimes get cussed out. I got cussed out when I did the support group in the safe house. It's fine. Because this is what I'm talking about, seeing past that veneer of, and when people tell me, they may be saying to me and putting themselves out there. And what I choose to see that as saying, please love me. Please see me. See how intense this is. See that I am hurting. And don't judge me and don't shame me for this. So if we can kind of see what that behavior really means instead of what it on the surface it looks like.
So we spoke a little bit about in the pre-call how we wanted to have you all on, because this is an issue that disproportionately affects marginalized parts of society across the board, which makes this a justice issue. And so I wonder if you could share some of the factors that put people at risk of sex trafficking and human trafficking.
Yeah, so I'll first say that anyone can be impacted by human trafficking, but there are groups that are disproportionately exploited. People of color, immigrants, people who identify as LGBTQ plus individuals are exploited at a much higher rate. Are we surprised by this? No. But what Stacey mentioned earlier, we've really only been recognizing this as a crime over the last 20 years. So now we're getting to a point where research is proving this disproportionate exploitation. So we're really making a point to make strategic choices about finding better ways to identify and serve these marginalized groups. But anyone who's really experiencing vulnerabilities or is susceptible or high risk can be anyone that's experiencing economic disparity, housing insecurity. So over 90% of the clients we serve come to us either homeless or have experienced homelessness at some point. So runaways, like mostly kids that are in foster care, as soon as they run away, they're immediately vulnerable to exploitation. Anyone who has a history of childhood sexual abuse, mental illness, substance abuse, and then anyone that's experiencing systemic oppression, all of these folks are vulnerable to exploitation.
Yeah.
And anyone who's experienced any one of these or sometimes multiple vulnerabilities are even more susceptible to exploitation. We talk about how it happens in your backyard. And yes, that's true because it is happening in Brentwood and Franklin and all of these suburban areas. But we do know for a fact that it is targeting more marginalized populations.
Well, in the pre-interview, when we talked with you guys a couple weeks ago, we sensed that that there is an ever-present awareness of multiple victims in a trafficking situation, multiple people who have experienced harm. And as believers, we're called to great compassion and kindness for every life. So what does that look like for you all in terms of justice and kindness towards not only the survivors, but also the perpetrators of the harm as well?
Yeah, that's a very complex question, right? When we look at all the people why is human trafficking even around? Well, it's supply and demand, right? If we didn't have demand for, well, in our case, mostly it's sex trafficking. If we didn't have a demand for it, we wouldn't have the crime. So when we look at who that is, those actors in this situation, by and large, it's mostly men who are the exploiters and mostly women who are the exploited. That can, and then the traffickers too. I mean, that can be anybody really. Right. But we by and large see that trend. We as an organization, of course, we are serving survivors, and we don't, we wouldn't. That's the population that we're working with, and we you've heard what we can do. But I also believe, with my faith walk and my faith journey, the conviction to find a path of redemption for all. It's very uncomfortable, which means I care about it. So, and the real truth of the matter is, how do you solve a problem like this unless you can find a path for redemption and recovery for all the people engaged? We, in our organization, we definitely are doing that with the survivors. But I encourage people to, especially churches or other religious organizations, to consider that we are affected by this. All of us, in my opinion, are culpable in human trafficking. We all have a piece to play. Now, not everybody has purchased sex or watched pornography, which also, feeds that.
Yeah. Right.
But we probably all have bought clothing or food where we don't know where it was sourced, and things are not as expensive. There's a reason why.
Yeah.
I don't say that to make people feel guilty or ashamed of themselves, but I do say it to help people kind of think about, and this is what I've done. I thought carefully about the choices that I make, especially when purchasing things. I want to make sure that I can make a little choice. I can't figure it all out in one day. I can't figure it all out, but I can make a small choice today that I can make sure that I drink coffee that's sourced well, one step at a time. And I think when it comes to finding redemption for particularly perpetrators, the biggest number of people that cause human trafficking, if we don't do that, we don't stop it.
Right.
Yeah.
And if we use blame and shame, especially shame, it keeps us from talking about it. So there's no chance to heal if we can't find a way. And there has to be safeguards. You can't just say, "Oh, forgiven.
Right.
God said it. It's done." I think that's pretty glib, because there's a whole series of choices that got someone to make that into that path where they were not doing things that were redemptive. And so there's a whole path you have to get back to being redemptive. But I hope it, because there's nothing more powerful than someone who's got a story of redemption,
Right.
To help others know it's possible.
Yeah. I think so much often about how structures of supremacy that are built upon wielding power over the innocent, over the vulnerable, over the weak, people can't engage in those kinds of behaviors without degrading their own humanity in the process. And so I love what you're talking about. What does it look like for all parties involved to come back to the Imago Dei that's inherent in all of us?
Well, and what does that look like for us as believers who are called to bless those who persecute us and to pray for our enemies and to forgive those no matter what? I mean, like you said, forgiveness is just one part of the process. You can't just say, "I forgive," and that's it. But like blessing and bringing forth that redemption with Christ is, I mean, when you put it in this practical sense, in this scenario, that becomes really hard.
Yes, it becomes uncomfortable. I love how, Stacey, you're talking about just, okay, it's uncomfortable, which means that's probably where God's leading. And so I'm curious how you've seen, we're looking at the intersection of formation and justice. Where have you seen Christians and even the church, for lack of a better word, continue to perpetuate harm? And also, where have you seen them really step in and take part in that redemption story?
I think one thing I experienced, I think a lot of times when human trafficking comes up and sex trafficking, it usually gets put in the women's ministry. Well, that's a women's issue, and because when I think, at least my experience, what I've seen is, it's a lot of women helping women recover. But what I think one of the hard parts that I would like to see is churches stepping up and some of the leadership saying, "Wait a minute, men, this should be, what can we do to help? We need to help keep each other accountable." It's hard for a woman in sex, and it's just harder. We need everybody at the table, I think, is what I'm wanting to say, is every voice, and then being honest with each other about what's happening. Again, that's the shame stuff, and humble. It would be really nice to acknowledge it as human trafficking as an all people. And then I think too, sometimes it's the churches that are siloed off to help to focus more on the marginalized. We've had some churches that have focused to be inclusive with LGBTQI plus. Those churches are addressing this, right, in a direct way, because, well, it disproportionately affects. And I think I see some African American churches going in that direction too, and wanting to, because it's disproportionate.
You know, one of the questions we were going to ask is just talking about how women make a large percentage of this, but there are men also
who are trafficked.
Yes.
So maybe
Yes.
if you could expand on that a bit and about why it's important for it not to just be relegated to the women's ministry, and what are some things men specifically can do, because our listeners are both men and women.
Yes.
And but speak to the men, like what can they specifically do?
Well, I think what's interesting about our research in general, we've only been really looking at this critically for 20 years. So much of the research that comes out is new, and some of it's startling. I remember in 2012 when we were startled to find out that it was the patterns that we were seeing were happening in rural counties significantly, right? That's not something that a lot of people were thinking about. And I think one of the things that as the more we learn and keep going on, we're going to see more communities that are affected by this in bigger ways than we imagined.
Right.
Caitlin mentioned LGBTQI plus and other types of oppressed communities. I think we're going to see more men. I think to me, that's what I'm noticing when I do some of the work I do in education at the John School, which is where men who've participated in prostitution, been arrested for prostitution, go to learn more about what their crime they have the impact of their crime.
Yeah.
But what I'm noticing there is I'm seeing more. It looks like there might be more men victims than we thought. That's just anecdotal.
Well, isn't it more difficult for men to come forward too?
Yeah.
It absolutely is. And you think about the history, you think about some of the things we've heard about in the news, with the Catholic Church. We've seen just the pressure of hiding and not talking about things, and some of the new paths of redemption that are happening there. And healing is possible when we put it out there and we actually let our faith do what it was designed to do. Confession, taking our cares before God, taking our sin or our guilt or our shame and letting that sift through the unconditional love so that it can be used for good. I mean, abuse is terrible. But there's a lot more people that experience it. And I think in the churches are wonderful places where people can come. And if they know it's a safe space to heal, I mean, think of what could happen if people could find that kind of redemption by being able to confess that they have been dealing with something and get the kind of help they need to move safely out of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like Stacy's taking us to church today.
She is, and it might feel, no, it's good. It's so good. It also, so this might feel like a little shift almost, because I want to bring the political piece into it and the ways that laws and systems and policies need to be put in place to change some of the ways that we, like you were talking about, the way that police approach prostitution and things like this. So I'm curious for you guys, because humans are being exploited and money comes into the picture. So it's a money-making machine. How have you all navigated that uphill climb with lawmakers and even, law enforcement, like you mentioned?
Yeah, so like Stacey mentioned earlier, 10 years ago, we started as an awareness and an advocacy organization and then moved into aftercare. But we've always been working that advocacy piece, working to make systemic change. And we are working on the state and national level with state officials, members of the legislation, as well as national organizations to really change systems at both levels through legislation and education. And like Stacey mentioned again earlier, the first piece of legislation that we helped to establish was to fund a human trafficking unit at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. And that's ultimately how we got our CEO, Margie Quinn, who's a former agent. She's seen the crime from both sides. law enforcement and now aftercare. And so she's using her expertise to continue to build those collaborative efforts. And we've become a model for other organizations across the country. And that's ultimately led us to creating this great relationship with the state government. We are designated as the regional point of contact for all 41 counties in Middle Tennessee for victim referrals.
That's awesome.
And we're training law enforcement officers and corrections officers on how to recognize victims and how to respond in a trauma-informed way. So like Stacy mentioned earlier, that shift of we're not arresting victims for prostitution, we are finding resources for them as survivors. And we are instead prosecuting the traffickers and the buyers. And a lot of that legislative work that we've done is for harsher punishments for traffickers and buyers. And for expungement for survivors. They might have committed a crime while they were being trafficked. Making sure that those crimes are expunged, and making sure that they're being directed toward the proper resources in order to heal from their victimization. We work with the Human Trafficking Court here in Middle Tennessee, which diverts victims from incarceration into our program. It offers them an alternative to incarceration. We've also passed legislation here in the state of Tennessee for mandatory training for public educators. So all public educators in the state of Tennessee take a mandatory human trafficking training that we have designed. And we've helped shift a lot of the ways of thinking for law enforcement and the judicial system and how to properly identify victims, prosecute traffickers and buyers, and direct survivors toward those resources. And we have a lot more detail about the things that we've done in the last 10 years that are available on our podcast. And all of those trainings that we offer frontline professionals, law enforcement, corrections officers, teachers, teenagers, preteens, etc. All those trainings are available for free on our website.
That actually leads me, it makes me super curious for your perspective on this, because so much of what we've talked about, the research, the information, it's been kind of, everything's become so intertwined. The LGBTQI community, systemic oppression, all of that stuff has become so politicized and polarized, even within the church community. And I would unfortunately say that there's a lot of people in the faith community that have perpetuated misinformation that's out there. I mean, could you speak to that? Because what you're talking about, all this awareness and this training and being able to identify victims and situations, and then you turn on your social media and you have like hashtag save the children and this is a front for trafficking. And I mean, there's just so much out there. Can you bring some clarity to that for our community?
I would say at the end of the day, all of that misinformation, those posts that you're resharing on social media and those falsehoods that you're perpetuating, at the end of the day, they prevent victims from identifying, and which doesn't allow them to get the resources that they need to heal from their exploitation, and instead keeps you over here, your attention over here while the crime's happening over here. And if we aren't correctly identifying the crime, the perpetrators, the victims, then we are not doing our job. And as members of this community, we are not doing our job. And all we're doing when we're sharing these pieces of misinformation on social media or telling a friend like, hey, this is what I heard, we are hurting the people that are being exploited.
Yeah.
And what about the people who are doing the actual work? I mean, how have you found, I mean, particularly in the wake of 2020 and 2021, with so many conspiracy theories around, have you found that that's interfered with your work?
Yeah. I mean, what it does, it diverts our attention, right? So we have to address that in the community. I want to go back just a minute though, because there are some big dynamics at play here that are just human dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
When we hear human trafficking, it is horrible. It's a horrible thought. And I think sometimes people, because they're fearful, this comes out of a place of fear.
Yeah.
And when people hear something and it makes them nervous, their first response is, I want to protect, right? And so they want to get it out there. They want to get that information out there because they want to protect people. That's a beautiful thing, okay? So I'll start with that. That initial motivation to protect is beautiful. But the best way, in my experience, is to take the time to deal with that fear. Where's it coming from? And making sure that out of that fear, you don't do something harmful.
Yeah.
Take the time to look at where the places are sourced, especially with social media. We all know things can get a little emotional on social media and go off track and really not do the job that you're trying to convince somebody to change or think in a different way. So I think we have an opportunity as people of faith with all kinds of practices or historical practices of meditation and study to show ourselves approved. I mean, all these things are the tools that we in faith communities have to respond responsibly and build programming that helps us learn and keep growing so that we continue to act, and so that we're looking at who said that. Is it okay? It makes me nervous, but is it true?
Yeah.
And how does it further help the people that are really being victimized here? Because that's who we're supposed to be serving. Is it serving the victim, or is it serving the potential? Who's that really serving? Oh, I'll say one more thing. Sometimes we've seen that it really serves the person who is actually wanting to be the savior. Is it okay to say that? I mean, there's a real feeling of, I've done something and I want to be a part of something. But I think what's really important, and what I've been learning in my faith journey, is as a social worker, I remember when I first went in, somebody told me, "Oh, you're Save the World." That's what social worker means, MSW, Master of Saving the World. And I was like, "Oh, okay," but that's not my job.
Right.
I don't want that to be my job.
That's actually not what I believe.
Yeah.
That's kind of it's not it. And I don't want to save the world. That's really in the realm of God. But what I do want to do is I want to be part of that happening. And I think we get caught up though in that idea of, as believers, we have to do something that is involved in that saving process.
That it's up to us.
Yeah. We don't even use the term rescue anymore. We've learned that that's a word that it puts all the power into the person who's rescuing, and none of the power into the person we're hoping to empower. Right? So I say check yourself.
Yes. Well, as you talk about being part of the solution, I'm curious, as we shift to wrapping up our time together, we'd love to we like to ask our guests, are there any questions or categories around formation, justice, and peace that maybe people wish people were asking or considering?
Yeah, I think the one and maybe two things that I hope people will start asking themselves, or ask themselves more often, is, are you checking your motivations? Are we checking our motivations? Why are we doing this work? Why do we feel called to do this work? What is the reason behind what we're doing? And sometimes you can realize, like, oh, it's way more self-serving than it is serving others.
Well, it took you 4 years of praying and thinking before you actually even stepped into the arena, right?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't feel like there was a place for me until it happened. And I still feel that way sometimes. And the other is, are we acting and are we serving with empathy and humility? Again, going back to the point where anyone can be affected by this. Anyone can be impacted. Anyone can be exploited. Yes, there are folks that are being exploited at a higher rate than others, but none of us are above this. None of us are above exploitation and being taken advantage of. And just remembering that in an instant, we could be put in one of these positions. And are we serving these victims and survivors with empathy? Are we operating with empathy and humility? And just remembering that, and casting aside judgment and blame and shame, and focusing on the road ahead.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for spending time with us today. This has been such a fruitful and helpful conversation. I'm so appreciative of your time and the work that you all are doing. And I will be in touch very soon.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to see what you're doing. And I really appreciate that you're out there in the community having voice to justice issues. I think that's really important, especially in the faith community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Peace Talks, a production of the Center for Formation, Justice, and Peace.
Each episode is produced on Cherokee, Yuchi, and Shawnee land by Britt Simmons and Creative Means.
If you're enjoying Peace Talks, we'd invite you to follow us on social media at CenterFJP or visit our website, centerfjp.org.
In closing, we offer this poem entitled To Be a Realist from Drew Jackson in God Speaks Through Wombs, based on the story of Jesus raising a little girl from the dead in Luke 8.
I am a realist. I deal in the logical, but sometimes reality must give way to impossible, especially for the sake of our children.
Grace and peace.